In the fall of 1975, three young hikers set out on a trip that they would never forget. The Appalachian Mountains, with their towering trees and thick fog, were a place that many had warned them about. But to Elijah, Sophie, and Noah, the mystery of the mountains called to them like a whisper in the wind. They had been hiking together for years, each one sharing a deep connection to the outdoors. This time, however, something felt different. The air was thick, the trees too still, as though nature itself was holding its breath. They were miles off the marked trail when they stumbled upon it. The cabin. Hidden deep within the thick forest, the decrepit structure seemed as though it had been abandoned for centuries. Its roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the windows were covered in grime, making it impossible to see inside. Still, it felt oddly inviting, as if it was waiting for them to find it. "We'll rest here for the night," Elijah suggested, already pulling his backpack off his shoulders. "We're far from the nearest camp, and I don't feel like trekking back in the dark." Sophie hesitated. "Something feels off," she murmured, glancing nervously at the shadows dancing across the cabin's weathered walls. Noah, ever the optimist, laughed it off. "Oh, come on, Soph, it's just a cabin. What's the worst that could happen?" They made their way inside, the wooden door creaking open on rusted hinges. The interior was just as old as the exterior, with dusty furniture scattered around in disarray. A fireplace stood in the corner, but it had been unused for many years, the hearth empty and cold. Yet despite the decay, there was something unsettlingly alive about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Elijah tried to shake off the feeling as he sat down in front of the fireplace. "We'll be fine. It's just a cabin." Noah, after poking around a bit, found an old oil lamp and lit it, casting flickering shadows across the room. The smell of mildew and decay hung heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of the damp earth from outside. Sophie was quiet, her eyes flickering nervously as she glanced toward the door. It was as if she could sense something watching them, something lurking just beyond their reach. As night fell, the atmosphere grew heavier. A light mist rolled in, blurring the world outside the cabin's thin walls. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional crack of the wood in the fireplace. Elijah dozed off, his back resting against the cold stone, but Sophie and Noah stayed awake, the eerie quiet making them uneasy. That's when the old man appeared. He looked as though he had come out of the very earth itself, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, deep and empty, as though they had seen things no human ever should. He shuffled toward the cabin, his gnarled hands gripping the doorframe as he peered inside. "What are you doing here?" he croaked, his voice a dry rasp that sent a chill down Sophie's spine. Noah stood up quickly, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "We're just passing through. We didn't mean any harm." The old man's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light of the cabin. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The woods, they are not as they seem. They have a life of their own, a darkness that never leaves. Once it takes hold, it will not let you go." Sophie felt a shiver run down her spine as the air around them grew colder. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man turned his gaze to the trees beyond the cabin, his eyes clouded with fear. "The woods, they watch, they wait, and they feed on the lost, the curious. I've seen it happen before. You must leave before the sun sets, or the woods will claim you." Noah scoffed, rolling his eyes. "That's just an old man's tale. We'll be fine." The old man's hollow eyes locked onto Noah's. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he muttered before turning and disappearing into the mist. The three hikers exchanged uneasy glances, but they decided to ignore the old man's warnings. The night stretched on, and as the hours passed, a sense of dread began to settle over the cabin. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to rest, but her mind was too active, thoughts racing as the sounds of the night grew louder. Then, just as she was beginning to drift off, it started. Whispers, faint disembodied voices, like the wind itself was speaking in a language she couldn't understand. She bolted upright, heart pounding in her chest. But when she looked around, nothing was there. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old timbers. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Noah looked at her with tired eyes. "It's just the wind, Soph. Relax." But Sophie couldn't. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent. And then through the window, she saw something, a figure fleeting and shadowed, moving just outside the cabin. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that stretched unnaturally. It moved with a disturbing fluidity, like it wasn't entirely bound by the laws of nature. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the mist. Elijah stood up abruptly, his eyes wide. "I don't like this. We need to go." But it was too late. As they gathered their things, the cabin seemed to close in around them. The walls creaked louder. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices that filled their ears. And that's when they realized it wasn't just the woods that were alive. The cabin, too, seemed to breathe, shifting and warping with each passing second. Sophie reached for the door, but before she could open it, a loud crash echoed through the room. Something was coming. The floorboards beneath their feet shook, and the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the room went cold. The light from the oil lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Sophie's heart raced, her breath quickening, as she felt the presence of something terrible, just outside the door. And then it stopped. Silence. But the silence was worse than the noise. It was as though the woods were waiting, holding its breath, ready to strike. Sophie looked at Elijah and Noah. "We need to leave. Now." They didn't argue, but as they reached the door, something stopped them. One of them was missing. Panic struck as they turned around to find one of their own gone. It was Noah. He had been standing right beside them, just moments before, his hand reaching for the door. But now he was nowhere to be found. The door had been closed and the room felt heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in. "Elijah!" "Noah?" Sophie called out, her voice trembling, but only silence answered her. The cold air around them seemed to thicken, swirling, as if the cabin was alive, hungry, waiting for more. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the dark corners of the room. "Elijah! What happened?" Sophie gasped, her hands shaking as she grabbed his arm. Elijah looked equally terrified, his face pale in the dim light. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. It was then that Sophie noticed the air had grown stifling. The whispers were louder now, rushing through the room like a wind that carried with it the weight of 1,000 voices. Some of them seemed familiar. They sounded like Noah's voice, but distorted, fragmented as if they came from deep within the earth. "Elijah, we have to find him. We can't leave him here," Sophie urged, her eyes frantic. But Elijah's gaze was fixed on the window, and his body was frozen in place. "Look outside," he whispered, his voice low, hoarse. Sophie's gaze snapped toward the window. She could barely see through the fog, but there in the distance was something moving. Slowly, deliberately, it came closer, like a shadow creeping through the trees. The figure was tall, too tall to be human, with limbs that stretched unnaturally, just like the ones she had seen earlier. And then, to her horror, she realized it wasn't just one figure. There were many, dozens, all moving with the same eerie, unnatural fluidity. "No," Sophie whispered, taking a step back. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the presence outside was too real. It felt as though it was pressing against the cabin, as though it were about to burst through the walls. "Elijah, we need to get out." "Now," Sophie begged, her voice breaking. But Elijah didn't respond. His eyes were wide, his mouth agape, staring out the window like he had lost the ability to move or think. It was as if he was being drawn into something he couldn't escape. The whispers were now deafening. They filled the room, seeping into Sophie's mind, making it harder for her to think, harder to breathe. The air was thick with something ancient, something that had been here long before they arrived, and something that wouldn't let them leave. Sophie grabbed Elijah's arm, pulling him toward the door, but he didn't budge. "Elijah!" she screamed, shaking him violently. Finally, his head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear it?" he gasped. "The voices, they're calling us, calling me." Sophie's heart sank. She didn't understand, but the terror in Elijah's eyes told her everything she needed to know. Whatever had happened to Noah had already begun to claim Elijah too. "We have to go," Sophie cried, her voice raw with panic. But before they could make another move, a loud banging echoed from the door. It was sharp, violent, as though someone or something was trying to break in. The air around them crackled, like the very walls of the cabin were alive, shaking with the force of something terrible trying to get through. Sophie's breath hitched as she backed away, her heart racing in her chest. Without warning, the door flew open. The mist rushed inside, cold and suffocating. But what followed was worse. The tall, twisted figures were standing in the doorway. They were everywhere now, their elongated limbs reaching towards Sophie and Elijah. Their eyes were black voids, empty, hungry. They moved in a way that defied nature, and Sophie could feel the weight of their gaze, as if they were searching for something that wasn't meant to be found. Sophie screamed, pushing past Elijah in a desperate attempt to escape, but the figures were too fast. They reached for her, cold fingers brushing her skin, and she felt a sudden, crushing force, pulling her back toward them. She stumbled, gasping for breath, but their grip was relentless. Then through the chaos, Sophie heard a voice, a low, haunting whisper that seemed to come from all around her. "You should have left before sunset." It was the old man. His voice, once distant and strange, now filled the cabin, as though it was alive within the walls themselves. Sophie turned toward him, but there was no sign of him. Only the dark, endless figures that surrounded them. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures stopped. The air cleared, and the room fell silent once more. Sophie stood frozen, heart racing, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned to face him, only to find him gone. Her pulse quickened. "Elijah!" she cried, stepping back. There was no answer. He was gone, vanished into thin air as if he had never been there at all. Only Sophie remained, trembling, her mind unraveling as the gravity of the situation set in. She fled. She ran out the door, through the mist, her breath ragged as she stumbled across the forest floor. Her legs burned, her heart hammered in her chest, but she couldn't stop. She didn't dare look back. The air was suffocating, thick with the presence of something dark, something ancient that had claimed her friends. But when she reached the edge of the woods, she froze. The cabin was gone. There was nothing but an empty clearing, the mist swirling in the breeze. The forest around her was silent, as though it had swallowed up the cabin and everything inside it. Sophie collapsed to the ground, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had made it out, but at what cost? Authorities never found Elijah or Noah. No one believed Sophie when she told them about the figures, the whispers, the old man. They chalked it up to the wild stories of a scared hiker lost in the woods. But in the quiet town nearby, locals whisper about the Appalachian Mountains, about the strange disappearances that happen in the woods. They speak of the cabin, of the woods that have a life of their own. And some say the old man never left, that he's still out there waiting for the next to stray too far from the trail.